Welcome to Commune, a global wellness community and online course platform featuring some of the world's greatest teachers. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, pass down wisdom, and bring the world closer together. This is the Commune podcast, where each week we explore the ideas and practices that help us live this healthy, connected, and purpose-filled life. In addition to our courses on yoga, meditation, and personal development, Commune also offers an array of social impact courses, including Unwinding Prejudice, Redefining Leadership, and Organize a March. If you are interested in enrolling in any of those course offerings for free, please email me at jeffk@onecommune.com. Right now, I think we can all benefit from learning and growing in order to better serve our communities. Okay, so my guest on the show today is philosopher and writer Jules Evans. Jules has written 3 books, including Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, The Art of Losing Control, and Holiday from the Self. He writes about Stoicism, cognitive behavioral therapy, Aristotle, and plant medicine, which I find to be a brilliant combination of subjects. His output has been prolific during COVID, and I have come across a number of his articles published on Medium, including one that went viral entitled Nazi Hippies, When the New Age and the Far Right Overlap. Today on the show, we talk about the Third Reich's unexpected affinity for the occult, alternative medicine, and biodynamic farming. We talk about Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, and Krishnamurti. And we touch on the weaponization of misinformation on social media and the need to cultivate in real life community. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jules Evans. My name is Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune. Okay, Jules Evans, welcome to the Commune podcast. Thank you for taking your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we're many time zones apart. So as I was saying, I'm just having my first coffee, and you're likely headed to the pub. I came to your work through an article that I suppose one might say went viral, that talks about the horseshoeing of the New Age or spirituality and the far right, and or this sort of undetectable or non-obvious alignment between spirituality and authoritarianism. And I found it fascinating. And I wonder if, just to scaffold our conversation up front, you could provide some biographical information and outline some of the influences that are shaping your writings and your worldview, and how some of your current writings play into that overarching project that you are focusing on.
Sure. Thanks for that, for those nice words. Well, I got into spirituality and kind of 60s spirituality and psychedelics when I was a teenager. Like my favorite book when I was 16 was like The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. And my friends and I got quite into drugs, probably quite young. That then messed a lot of us up when we were, by the time we were 18, a lot of us had some, difficult drug experiences. Including me, so I had quite bad mental health from about 18 to 24. I got better thanks to first of all, a near-death experience I had when I was 24. I had a bad skiing accident and fell off a cliff and had a kind of white light encounter type experience, which was very healing for me. And then the second thing that really helped me get better was I got into ancient Greek philosophy and into Stoicism. And that kind of, both those experiences, both the near-death experience and Stoicism, gave me the same kind of insight, which was what was causing my suffering was my own beliefs, which I could change. And Stoicism and the type of therapy that it led to, called cognitive behavioral therapy, gave me the ability, a kind of systematic way to change my beliefs and to heal myself. So I wrote my first book, Philosophy for Life, about the revival of Stoicism today and how people can use Stoicism and are using Stoicism to flourish and heal themselves. And then in my second book, The Art of Losing Control, I thought back to that strange near-death experience I had and what it was and how ecstatic experiences can often be very healing for people. So in my second book, I looked at the kind of history and philosophy and psychology of ecstasy, of ecstatic experiences, and how people find them in modern Western culture, and when they're good for us and when they're bad for us. And when I was doing that book, the writer who was in a way most helpful to me was Aldous Huxley, who I'd read when I was a teenager. I went to the same school where he was a pupil and then a teacher. So I had a kind of connection to him. And we both went and did English literature at Oxford as well. But he was just, while researching this second book, I really grew in admiration for him and this kind of way he managed to bring together a historical analysis of ecstatic experiences with kind of scientific and psychological analysis, and all the way up to a kind of theology and kind of spirituality. So he really had this ability to kind of understand human experience and particularly ecstatic experiences at all these different levels. So he gave the title for my third little book, The Holiday from the Self. That's a quote from him. He often talks about how humans need these holidays from their selves. And that's why we seek ecstatic experiences. So what I'm working on at the moment is a kind of group biography of Aldous Huxley and his friends, people like Alan Watts and Krishnamurti, and how they moved to California and helped to invent the counterculture. And I suppose while writing that during this pandemic, I've started to, it started off really as a kind of book about how much I liked Aldous Huxley and admired him and what he's contributed to our culture. But over the last few months, I've also been exploring, I guess, the kind of dark side of Western spirituality, including, for example, things like the fact that Aldous Huxley was quite into eugenics his whole life, as was his brother Julian Huxley, who is a kind of leading eugenicist. And I suppose I've been exploring the kind of elitism one often finds in New Age spirituality, and the kind of hierarchy, the sorting of people into the spiritually fit and the unfit, and how that's and in a way how New Age spirituality is not always quite as fluffy and light as we might think it is. And that led me to part of that research has been looking at kind of the dark side of the human potential movement, and how Nazism was in some ways a kind of spiritual movement. I mean, this was kind of a surprise to me, but there's such a thing as like Nazi spirituality. Some of the ideas that Huxley and his friends were into played out in a rather dark and extreme way in 20s and 30s and 40s Germany.
Yeah, I suppose there were many ideas from Darwinism to the works of Nietzsche to Huxley, as you described, that were, I suppose, co-opted and for a particular agenda or narrative by the Nazis. But I'm wondering if you could hover there just a bit and talk a little bit about some of the kind of spiritual proclivities that arose in Weimar Germany.
Well, I mean, I've been reading historians like Eric Kurlander, who wrote a recent book called Hitler's Monsters, and another historian called Peter Staudenmayer. And they've written books looking at the relationship between the Nazis and the occult. So, leading Nazis, particularly Rudolf Hess and Heinrich Himmler, but several others as well, were very into the occult and alternative spirituality. So the Nazis set up uh, institutes to research parapsychology. They're very into astrology, into dowsing and divination. There were several leading Nazis were into things like Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, and particularly his theories of biodynamic agriculture, which is a kind of spiritual form of agriculture where the kind of people have a spiritual link to the soil. Um, they were also they drew on a kind of nature mysticism, this sense that the German people and the Aryan race have a spiritual connection to the land and to the forests. And they were big advocates of like holistic thinking. This idea that you need to transcend your individuality and feel like part of the whole, part of the biological whole, part of the ecosystem, part of the whole nation. So that kind of, and they were also into kind of the idea of an education for the whole person. They thought that modern society was too rationalistic and materialistic, and it had lost its soul, and it needed to rediscover its kind of mythical roots. So Nazis sponsored all kinds of strange research to find historical research to find Germany's mythical roots, including like paying people to go off and literally like look for the Holy Grail and or to go off to Tibet because they thought that the Aryan race included like Brahmin, upper-caste Indians and Tibetans. They thought that the Buddha was actually a blonde Aryan. So they had this kind of mysticism and spirituality, but it was very much racialized. It was very much Aryan and nationalist spirituality. But it's just, I suppose, it's just odd to find a lot of the things that we would, find in a nice kind of new age bookshop was also very popular with the Nazis. Like Himmler would carry around a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, and encouraged his SS troops to do yoga. They were very into alternative medicine. They got inmates at the Dachau concentration camp to work on growing alternative medicine. And this is not to say some people reacted to my article rather indignantly, and that I was saying, the New Age is essentially fascist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it is possible to be both into the New Age and into kind of fascism or far right politics. And the reason it's good to be aware is just because far right ideas are now spreading, as you know, through kind of New Age and wellness and spirituality networks. And so we shouldn't be blindsided by that. We should just be aware of that and aware that there is this historical overlap. So it's happened before and it can happen again.
Right. And I suppose there was also one of the crowning achievements of Hitler and the Nazis was their ability to sell the German people on a conspiracy fantasy
Mm.
that resembles some of the theories that we're seeing today, I suppose most closely associated with QAnon, but that all problems were rooted in kind of a hidden global elite. And in the case of the Nazis, that was clearly um, on a religious, that determination was on a strictly religious basis, or not strictly, but I suppose largely religious basis. Um, but I think you draw some, I guess, unnerving parallels between that fantasy that was sold to the German people and some of the, I guess, conspiracy oriented fantasies that are being concocted right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that the Nazis both promoted and believed in these kinds of occult conspiracy theories. In their case, the classic conspiracy theory found in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that there's a all powerful cabal of global Jews who control all world events, and they're kind of these demonic, almost superhuman beings who have a network of underground tunnels and steal children and drink their blood. Um, and they pose this kind of cosmic, existential, supernatural threat to the German people. But luckily, there's this messianic, light bearing guru figure in the Führer, who has these kinds of extraordinary powers of insight and wisdom, and will oppose this cabal and overthrow them, and there'll be a kind of time of suffering and pain, but then eventually there'll be 1,000-year reign of peace and glory. So this has got a lot of similarities to the QAnon conspiracy, which also has this idea of a hidden cabal. They're not Jews in QAnon, but they're kind of liberals and Democrats and Democratic politicians and Hollywood liberals who are also controlling all world events, controlling the media, and supposedly they have a kind of network of underground tunnels which they use to traffic children and drink their blood. But luckily, there's this messianic spiritual light bearer figure in Trump who will, save America and save the world. But we'll have to suspend democracy, and there'll have to be some, military trials and a lot of brutal punishment. Or this is what QAnon call like the storm. Um,
Right.
but then there'll be this, wonderful time of peace and love and light. So, and both these conspiracies draw on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, um, which historians think was actually created by Russian intelligence in around 1900 to foment anti-Semitism. And actually, they think that it was partly created or at least smuggled in by a couple of theosophists. So there is again this overlap between kind of New Age spirituality and pretty nasty conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and I believe I read that the publishing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was largely provided by Henry Ford. Um, so, so the crazy sort of labyrinth, goes on. I suppose I would also say that the QAnon theories are not disconnected from anti-Semitism, particularly in the claims around blood libel and adrenochrome, um, and the fact that its origins were the Chans, the 4chan, 8chan, and now 8kun, which were um, hotbeds for white nationalism and anti-Semitism. Um, so you just wonder if there's not just kind of some just general dog whistling
Sure, and
going on
I'm sure
there.
there are some people who are both QAnoners and hardcore anti-Semites. I think what's dangerous about QAnon is the way that it has mutated to appeal to different constituencies.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it is so shifting in its ways.
yeah,
And
yeah,
one day it can be 5G and its role in the transmissibility of COVID, and then kind of the next day it's a ring of pedophiles, and the next day, um, it's something else. And I think one of the greatest difficulties is that anyone that is committed to sort of a rigorous search for the truth um, cannot be an expert on every single component of this kind of shifting landscape of theories. So, it becomes, very difficult to debunk. And I suppose one could argue that the efforts to debunk are in some ways frivolous because folks that seem to embrace these theories seem to be unmoved by rational argument.
mm. Yeah. I
And
mean, I listened to your last episode interviewing the people from the Conspirituality podcast, and one of them said he'd read the entire John Podesta emails looking
that
for
was
like
me.
hot dog and pizza references, and you think, oh my gosh, it's hard work, And I've been
I know.
reading, and I've been reading like the books of David Icke just to try and
Sure.
understand kind of conspiracy theory mentality. And yeah, it's they kind of do your head in, when you're reading pages and pages of this stuff, and it's so copious. And it has the appearance of kind of logic, and then there are these huge leaps in logic, and you know, um, just dodgy forms of evidence brought in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to address. I have three daughters, and my youngest one is still very much in her curious phase. And, she will ask me different questions about how the world works. And, I'll do my best to summon some form of empirical response, from my faulty dementia. Um, but her retort is always, well, still, why? And any answer I give her, there's just another question of why, until I'm reduced to sort of basically a puddle of intuition. um, uh, um, but I'm curious, you know as we see, misinformation weaponized um, on social media, and a increasing polarization and tribalization of society. Um, what are your feelings around kind of the long-term viability of democracy in a world that seems to lack an ability to talk with itself? And are you concerned around uh, sort of an efflorescence of authoritarianism right now?
Um, I'm I'm definitely concerned when I see news reports about different militias facing off in American cities, and it seems like people have just lost faith in the ability to for like democratic processes to find compromises, and for like peaceful handover of power. Um, so yes, it is worrying, and these kind of emergencies we're facing, they're not going to go away. We're going to keep on facing them, possibly worse as global warming continues. Um, but so I mean, we're in a transition period after a few decades of peace and growth, and I think in those transition periods, the ruling myth breaks down. And in our case, I guess the ruling myth was just growth and things are getting better. And when the ruling myth breaks down, I think a lot of alternative myths come in, a lot of kind of conspiracy theories and toxic ideas. But that's part of the process of new thinking emerging. There's, it's like a flood of stuff from the subliminal mind, you could say, and a lot of it's pretty toxic. But you know, I still have some optimism that you know there's a readjustment happening. There's a necessary revealing of stuff that was hidden, and a new myth will emerge to help us cope with the times we're in. And I guess I do think democracy is the best system. I mean, it's the most adaptive, functional system. So I'm not. I mean, we could be in for a rocky 10 years or so. I mean, you think about people in the 20s and early 30s, and they had a very tough 15 years. Or imagine if you're around in 1910, and you really had a tough kind of 35 years. But uh, you know, democracy still emerged stronger than before after all these kinds of extremist philosophies had their moments. So I am, I guess, still optimistic about it.
It's funny, Maslow, who obviously created the famous hierarchy of needs, which has typically been understood to culminate kind of at the top of the pyramid with this idea of self-actualization. He started writing later in his journals about what actually comes after, um, and that self-actualization cannot be an end unto itself. And I suppose this, in some ways, may refer to or have a sibling in Buddhism, where self transcendence is a a beautiful aim or target, but that on the other side of that, there needs to be sort of good work and ethical action, and a re-emergence in the society around you to uh, to commit to a more collective sense of well-being or flourishing, um, and that is certainly something that I don't think we see right now.
I mean, yeah, I think I definitely agree with that vision you've kind of laid out of a spirituality that's tried to. There's not just about self-actualization, but it's also about good works and trying to improve your society. But I think it's also important the kind of the bit of Western spirituality defined itself against Christianity often, and it's quite Nietzschean in that way. Like Nietzsche was a huge influence on it, so it rejects the idea of good works and philanthropy as a bit kind of sickly and Victorian and sentimental, or even counterproductive. Um, and it also rejects the idea of humility, that you should be kind of, there's a kind of pagan pride. You should become like a god. We are like gods, as Stuart Brand put it. Therefore, we should become good at it. And I think you even see that in Maslow. There's this idea you get, and it's, like who are the top 5%? So you've got the self-actualizers, and then maybe there's only like 10% of the population who are self-actualizers, and then you've got the 3% or so. I'm just making it up, but like who are self-transcenders, and they are the ultimate people, the peak individuals. He thought like Aldous Huxley was like one of these rare people. So you see, there's a kind of spiritual hierarchy there, and of course, people who think like that always think of themselves as on the kind of top evolutionary rung. And then you can have this kind of, it's easy if you're thinking that spiritually hierarchical way to then, look down at the messy people at the bottom and think, well, what a waste of time. And I think in Maslow's journals, I'm still researching it, but I think you do come across that kind of Nietzschean contempt for the lesser beings who are less actualized and realized. So I guess that like the kind of the humility one can get of just thinking, look, I'm doing my best, but I'm kind of, I still fail a lot of the time, like everyone else. I'm not necessarily that advanced. That kind of humility and wariness of spiritual hierarchies, I think, is quite helpful for us in this community and in this kind of culture.
I'm, to be honest, really kind of publicly struggling with the utility of religion. And because I see how important it is for community bonds. And just like you described, this idea of coming together, of being a part of something that's greater than yourself. And we live in a society of kind of cutthroat capitalism and individuation and kind of constant feelings of deficiency and not enoughness, as we kind of turn our head any which way, all we can see are sort of images of unattainable perfection. And then we're in turn marketed gadgets and products and services and gizmos to sort of address that perceived kind of deficiency. And kind of through that mental torture, we become more and more isolated and lonely and atomized. And this is where I believe the church, just as an institution, is so important because it can bring people together in states of ecstasy. I mean, God, how many opportunities do we get in this day and age to be in full alignment with a couple of hundred people or however big your congregation is in an act of creative expression? I mean, what a beautiful opportunity. What an amazing way to spend your life.
Yeah.
And I suppose the downside is that it's rooted in texts that support in some effect slavery and stoning for apostasy, or working on the Sabbath, or being of an alternate sexual orientation, etc. So this is really the what I've been brooding over, is that how do we provide those forums and that opportunity for people to connect, for there to be places of community, but I suppose strip out the more kind of deleterious fundamentalist components of it. And to be honest, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I mean, but you used to have a company that well, is still going, that ran loads of events. So I suppose you have done things that have brought people together in their thousands, no? I
Yes,
guess
true.
so. Yeah,
I will just say my one misgiving, kind of in retrospect, with Wanderlust, and we were able to create these kind of peak experiences of community. But then, a couple days later, we'd pack up the trucks and off we went.
yeah,
Uh, and and where I think my wife told me this one day in an unexpected moment, when I asked her what are the core ingredients for the fostering of community, and she said something I didn't expect. She said continuity.
Mm.
And it was a real light bulb moment for me because I was under this impression that Wanderlust was creating all of this community all the time. But then, I really did think about it more critically. And I said, I begun to understand that community really does need continuity. And, this is kind of one of my big worries with, the pandemic, where, at least in the United States, half of the yoga studios have closed, probably for good.
Wow.
And these places were wonderful for asana, but what they were really about at the end of the day was intentional community, or kula. And now it's all just, influencers streaming on Zoom. And in a way, there's, some positive implications of that. There's no middleman, and teachers are having a more direct communication and keeping more of the margin, economically. But there really is an absence of that connection that happens after a yoga class or a group meditation, where you've had some form of transformational experience, and then you go to the cafe or to the parking lot or wherever, and you connect with someone else in a way that is just irreplaceable. So I worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And instead people go online and go down a YouTube rabbit hole, and I think conspiracy theories are offering a form of connection, but a rather
Mm,
toxic form of
yeah.
connection, and I think that's true in for churches as well. They've got a real problem on their hands with it too. But in terms of like, I don't know, let's say thinking in terms of a year or two later, when hopefully the pandemic has eased. What do we do? How do we help people find more connection and not just relying on, pills to numb their pain, and kind of, but to get genuine face to face kind of connection and meaning? I feel like, um, New Age spirituality has often had a kind of institutional weakness. It was started by it was developed by people like, let's say, Huxley and Alan Watts and Krishnamurti and others, and they were always kind of like, it was this modernist impulse to break free of institutions, or even to break free of your country as well, to be a kind of spiritual nomad, a restless seeker. There's a good book on the history of spirituality called Restless Seekers. It's like, if you read D.H. Lawrence's Rainbow, D.H. Lawrence himself was a kind of restless spiritual tourist. And the heroine of the Rainbow ends with her saying, I have no father, no mother, no country. And she's completely kind of burst free. Same with Nietzsche, this restless spiritual tourist. But after a while, you need to kind of build communities and build institutions, because institutions are like, they're like the logs that keep the fire burning. Otherwise, you just have these brief kind of flames, these brief spiritual movements which don't just keep kind of burning and keep that continuity, like your wife put it. So there's just, so few of those kinds of institutions in New Age spirituality. There's things like Esalen, which is this lodestar for lots of people in this culture, because it's been going 60 years. That's amazing. But even there, it's still, it's not, you've got to pay. It's pay as you go. You pay quite a lot for these courses, and these courses, as you say, only last like a weekend or a week. Um, and there's an irony there that spiritual seekers like me yearn for community and connection, but we often have to travel for miles to get it and spend a week among strangers. Like, I went and did an ayahuasca retreat in the Amazon, and me and my fellow pilgrims, we all yearned for connection. We all felt this kind of disconnection and loneliness, and we really had that for a week. This real sense of our hearts being open and connected to each other. But then we all go back to our, separate countries.
Yeah, do you feel that that could be addressed through the establishment of institutions, like you say, but in physical form? I mean, this was one of my, you know, thought streams for a while, where
Mm.
I started to see, I think in the United States at one point there were more yoga studios than McDonald's. There were 24,000 yoga studios, mostly very, very mom and pop, and you know one room little fluorescent rooms in a mini mall or something, but they were at least providing some glue for community. And I'm not predisposed to yoga per se, uh, uh, but it was, I think, an example of, okay, I was looking at, like, okay, well, how many churches are there in the United States? 250,000 or something like that. Are there other places for community gathering around spiritual concepts that might not be as kind of fundamentalist in nature? And so I wonder if there are institutions kind of at a local level, because I think, as you say, you'll go and have this retreat experience, which is,
Mm.
one might call like a very peak experience. But then how do you sustain that kind of through your quotidian life? And are you able to do that kind of on online small circle groups? Can digital media actually perform that function well? Or do we need these kind of physical um, locations in order to create that sense of community continuity?
I think so, yeah, and I think it's one of the things I felt in the lockdown was there was a rediscovery of the local. I did a report with my
Yeah.
with my brother for the Wellcome Trust, who are the biggest funders of medical research, and we did a report on how people coped during the lockdown mentally. And we looked at things like self care and mutual aid. So people coping with meditation, people coping with like philosophy. So like 10% of British people said they turned to philosophy during the lockdown, which is pretty extraordinary.
Hmm. Wow.
Gardening, cycling, cooking, but there was also this real growth of mutual aid. Like people, because they couldn't jet set around and because they were stuck in their streets, they literally got to meet neighbors they'd never met before, and they looked out for each other because, as well, like, governments weren't really working. The government didn't have its kind of stuff together. So this anarchist spirit of mutual aid grew out of the cracks, with people, looking out for their elderly neighbors or just for each other. If they had to isolate, others would get like food or medicine for them. And it gave me a sense that in emergency times, you're sometimes you're only as strong as your neighborhood. And I was very grateful that I'd moved to Bristol in that time, which has very strong a strong civic sense. It's a friendly place. People look out for each other, and that means a lot in emergency times. No, um, because you can just trust each other and trust that it's not all going to fall apart. Um, so it's been strange for me because I'm that kind of restless spiritual seeker type, and I love traveling for that. But it's forced me to just stay in this one place during the lockdown, and invest in the local community. So I think the local is important, on a personal level in terms of finding fulfillment and seeing if you can, like, I don't know, start up spiritual communities, but which don't become bubbles, but which try to help their local communities in practical, rolled up sleeves way. And that's always tricky, but that's the idea. So don't become just a kind of cultish bubble, but become open and friendly and helpful to the community. But then and then still do the occasional, like, online international thing, because that's great. I mean, that's brilliant. But I suspect we're all probably going to be traveling less, aren't we, in the years ahead, like flying less. So yeah, it probably is going to be a bit more local, but with the occasional, really great, international event, or online meetings and stuff. So yeah, I think local might be the way forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you and resonate with that a lot. I also wrote considerably about localization kind of in the early lockdown period as as a means to address a whole variety of different facets of life that I suppose were broken. Yeah, this notion that we don't even know our neighbors, their name or their health status, yet we're absolutely consumed with a comment that we got from someone on social media who lives halfway around the world. I think that in some ways, if we're looking at silver linings potentially of the lockdown, is that there was a reprioritization around certain facets of like what made life worthwhile in the first place. And I also suppose there's also something to be said around developing local economies that um, that address, I think, a lot of the anger and dis-ease associated with globalism. And why does the butter from New Zealand cost less than the butter that's made down the street? Well, there's a whole litany of reasons for that, none of which are particularly good. Um, I do think that that this idea of rooting down um, into the local um, is powerful. I was drawn to the 80th verse of the Tao, and I won't recite it here because I don't know it verbatim, but I do encourage everyone to read it because it's prophetic in
Mm.
some ways around how people can actually find true spiritual ease and happiness and contentedness is um, is in the local. And I suppose this is, T.S. Eliot also, talks about that is that, we'll wander our whole lives just to come back from the place which we started and know it for the first time, that God is where we are, or, there's plenty of different ways
Yeah.
of phrasing it. But, I think for just kind of personally, like I haven't traveled at all after running a company called Wanderlust, and all we did was travel,
Mm.
and and i- in a way, it was I think coming to terms that with the idea that one can really find a sense of peace and happiness in their own place. We have an election obviously coming up in the United States that takes up a lot of air. I assume even in the UK it gets
Yeah,
uh,
we're obsessed with American politics.
significant coverage.
Yeah.
And there is um, a worry that a lot of the um, unrest and I suppose um, rebellion against norms and institutions will come to a climax,
Mm.
um, if and when Trump refuses to leave office. Now, th- and and nobody knows what the outcome will be, and it is very fraught with many different kinds of circumstances. Obviously, it'll be much more difficult if the pandemic persists to vote in person, and there's this whole controversy with mail-in ballots, which may
Mm.
uh, give the perception on election night that Trump has um, obtain more votes, but then may control kind of the narrative, um, and and then the votes will be kind of the absentee votes will trickle in, and Biden will make a case as well, and we'll get into sort of a protracted legal kind of situation, which is going to only further undermine trust in the government as an institution, and then put I suppose blow more oxygen on the more extreme flames here, kind of the alt right and militia groups on the right, and Antifa and some of the more activist elements of the movement for Black Lives. Um, so we're sort of coming to this climax point, and and I think it has just a lot of people just so apoplectic or edgy and stressed out, and I wonder if you have any tips, I suppose, on how people can just manage, you know, and remain spiritually centered in a time that is so fraught.
Mm. I, the first thing I suppose is to kind of go easy on oneself and recognize that we're all feeling it. Um, it is pretty normal to feel tired and sad and afraid at the moment, and that's not pathological. That's a normal human response to very difficult circumstances. So that's the first thing in terms of framing it, and like to give oneself a break and not, the Buddhist idea of the second arrow. You kind of have pain and suffering, but then you can turn that into a story about why you're no good. And that's the kind of second arrow. And that's, don't do that. Just avoid turning your understandable suffering into a story about why you're no good. Um, I think there's, the Stoic technique of like accepting what you don't control and focusing on what you do. That we're in a time of the rapids where things are to some extent just sweeping along, and we as individuals have limited control, and a lot of things are just happening. And you're ne- you can do what you can, but you're not going to totally change the course of history by tweeting 100 times a day or something.
Mm,
So
yeah.
doing what you can, but knowing when to kind of step back from the streets, as it were. I mean, I don't mean completely disengage, but like uh, when to recharge and knowing how you recharge. Whether that's everyone will have their own coping mechanisms. Could be poetry or gardening, um, or just going for a walk, or playing with your dog. Um, so yeah, and I think that's and part of that for the Stoics, part of that stepping back and like accepting what you don't control and focusing on what you do. With the Stoics also had this kind of, I guess, sense of like cosmic hope. Like there were big processes going on, tectonic shifts, and you know, the human race is incredibly resilient. And I sometimes get a weird comfort from reading history about how rough it's been so often in the past. And I think the lack of that historical awareness makes us think, oh my God, this is the worst it's ever been. I remember in 2016, people were like, is 2016 the worst year ever? Because like Trump's been elected and Prince has died. And I was like, no, there's been some worse years than this. This is rough. There's been a lot worse than this. So I consider myself really an agnostic in terms of like, I'm pretty sure there is some kind of higher spiritual forces, which and the higher spiritual power is good, but I don't know for sure. And that's kind of beyond my pay grade. So I just try and be a good human in the here and now, like the Buddha tells us to. Like, he says, like, yes, there are these higher things, but you can't really understand it. But I do have that kind of basic sense of cosmic hope. Like our own individual lives, we do what we can, and they're a small bit of the picture, and we just do what we can. But I do have that overarching sense of I guess cosmic hope. So that's so the kind of focusing on what I can control, accepting what I can't, and just that kind of faith as well. Those are what helped me, and then making the effort to see my friends even when I don't want to, even when I feel tired and feel like just kind of emotionally self-isolating. Making the effort to kind of turn up and see my friends. And the awkwardness of making community. Like I'm a natural introvert, so I find it awkward. It's my birthday on Sunday, and I was like, oh, shall I have a party? It feels a bit awkward. I've just moved to this town. I don't know many people. Half of it was lockdown, so I don't really have very strong relationships here. Maybe I'll just hide away. And I was like, no, go on, have a party, invite people. If you build it, they will come. And so that's what I'm doing. So it's that we were talking about community, and it's awkward. Building community is awkward. And local community is awkward too, because there's often people, how much do we really have in common? But that kind of thing, I think, really pays you back in difficult times of just, going through the awkwardness of building local connections. So I think that's an important part of how we get through rough times.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Jules Evans. Check out his work at philosophyforlife.org. And as always, please feel free to email me directly at jeffk@onecommune.com with any questions or comments. That's all from the Commune for this week. My name is Jeff Krasno, and I'm here for you.